Most employees believe a comforting lie. They believe that if they work harder, stay loyal, arrive earlier, leave later, sacrifice weekends, fix other people's mistakes, and carry the weight of the team, eventually their boss will notice. Eventually, their boss will respect them. But if you observe workplaces with ruthless honesty, you begin to see a disturbing pattern. The hardest workers are rarely the most respected. They are the most used. The person who stays late becomes the person expected to stay late. The one who fixes problems becomes the one given every problem. The one who never complains becomes the one who is never considered dangerous enough to reward. And slowly, without realizing it, the hardest worker becomes the safest employee to exploit. Not because the boss is evil, because the boss is human. And humans, whether they admit it or not, operate on instincts far older than modern job titles. Instincts that were formed long before offices, meetings, or corporate culture existed. Instincts about hierarchy, about dominance, about threat, about value. And if you understand the brutal realism taught by Niccolò Machiavelli, you begin to see something most workers never realize. Respect is not a reward for effort. Respect is a response to power. This is the first illusion that must be destroyed inside your mind. Hard work signals usefulness, but usefulness alone does not command respect. In the natural world, the strongest animal is not the one working the hardest. It is the one that cannot be ignored, the one whose presence changes behavior. The predator does not earn respect through labor. It earns it through consequence. And your workplace is not nearly as civilized as people pretend. Strip away the polite language, the HR policies, the motivational speeches, and what remains is a quiet hierarchy constantly being measured by the human brain. Who can be pressured? Who can be ignored? Who can be delayed? Who can be denied? And most importantly, who can create problems if they are undervalued? Your boss may praise hard work, but praise is cheap. What truly changes how people treat you is something else entirely: leverage. Leverage is psychological gravity. It bends behavior. When someone possesses leverage, conversations shift, decisions change, people become careful. When someone lacks leverage, they become background noise. And this is where the majority of hard-working employees unknowingly sabotage themselves. They reveal that their effort is unconditional. They show they will continue performing no matter how they are treated. No resistance, no uncertainty, no consequences. From a psychological standpoint, this sends a devastating signal to the brain observing you. You are safe to exploit because you have already proven you will stay. This is not cruelty, this is conditioning. Human beings instinctively test the boundaries of those around them. Just as predators test prey for weakness, authority figures test subordinates for compliance. Sometimes subtly, sometimes unconsciously, but the test always happens. A deadline is moved, a request becomes a demand, a favor becomes a responsibility. Extra work appears without extra reward, and every time you accept it silently, something is being trained inside the minds of those around you. You are teaching them how to treat you. Most people think respect is given after years of proving loyalty, but Machiavellian reality is colder than that. Respect is often given the moment someone senses that mistreating you would carry risk. Risk of losing something valuable, risk of disruption, risk of resistance, risk of consequences. This is why the quiet employee who simply works harder rarely changes their position in the hierarchy, because effort without leverage looks like obedience, and obedience rarely commands respect. Now ask yourself something honestly. When your boss assigns more work, do they hesitate? Or do they already know the answer you will give? If the answer is predictable, then your value is already defined, and it may not be the value you hoped for. This realization makes many people uncomfortable because it forces a brutal question. Have you trained your workplace to respect you, or have you trained them to rely on your silence? There is a difference, a massive difference, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So I want to know who is truly paying attention. Comment this below. I refuse to stay invisible. Because the people who write that sentence understand something most employees never will. They understand that value is not just produced, it is projected. Now we are going to dissect the psychological mechanism that makes certain employees impossible to ignore, while others remain permanently replaceable. If you observe any workplace long enough, you begin to notice a strange contradiction. The employee who works the hardest is often treated like infrastructure, necessary but invisible, replaceable, expected. But the employee who works with strategic restraint, the one who occasionally refuses, delays, or redirects pressure, is treated differently. People become careful around them, not because they are rude, not because they are rebellious, but because their behavior introduces something rare inside hierarchical systems: uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the most powerful psychological forces in human interaction. Most workers try to eliminate uncertainty. They try to become predictable, reliable, consistent, always agreeable. They believe this builds trust. But from a Machiavellian perspective, excessive predictability creates weakness, because the human brain quickly categorizes predictable individuals as controllable. Once someone believes they can predict your response to pressure, they stop negotiating with you. They start assigning. This is the invisible transition many employees never notice. At first, they are asked, then they are expected, eventually they are assumed. And once that assumption forms, your effort stops being impressive. It becomes your baseline obligation. This is why pure hard work slowly loses its power. The brain adapts to it. Just as people adapt to noise, comfort, or routine, authority figures adapt to effort. What once looked exceptional becomes normal. But power does not come from normal. Power comes from controlled unpredictability. This is something predators understand instinctively. A predator that behaves in perfectly predictable patterns becomes easy to evade, but one that moves unpredictably forces constant awareness. Its presence demands attention. Now translate that into human hierarchy. When someone is endlessly agreeable, endlessly accommodating, endlessly available, they become mentally categorized as non-threatening. Their boundaries are assumed to be flexible. And once someone's boundaries are assumed to be flexible, pressure begins to accumulate around them. More requests, more responsibility, more urgency, but rarely more respect, because respect is tied to perceived limits. Let that sentence sink in. Respect is tied to perceived limits. When someone appears limitless in their willingness to give, the brain stops valuing their contribution. It begins exploiting their availability. This is not a conscious decision most bosses make. It is an instinctive one. Authority figures are constantly scanning their environment for two things: reliability and resistance. Reliability tells them who can carry weight. Resistance tells them where the boundaries are. And here lies the uncomfortable truth most employees never hear. Reliability without resistance creates servitude, but reliability combined with resistance creates authority. This is why some employees, despite working fewer hours, command far more respect than the tireless worker beside them. They are not careless, they are selective. Their effort appears deliberate, measured, intentional. They do not rush to prove loyalty through exhaustion. They allow their contributions to appear scarce. And scarcity is one of the oldest triggers of value in the human mind. The brain values what is limited: time, attention, skill, access. When these things appear abundant, they lose psychological weight. When they appear scarce, their value multiplies. This is why the employee who instantly says yes to everything slowly becomes overloaded, while the employee who pauses, evaluates, and occasionally declines becomes someone whose time is treated carefully. It is not about laziness, it is about signaling. You are constantly signaling your position in the hierarchy through your responses to pressure. Every request is a test, not always an intentional test, but a test nonetheless. Will you accept immediately? Will you negotiate? Will you redirect? Will you protect your time? Each response teaches the people above you how flexible your boundaries truly are, and human beings always push where boundaries are soft. Now here is the uncomfortable part. Many hard-working employees secretly fear resistance. They fear saying no, even once, will damage their reputation. They fear appearing difficult, uncooperative, uncommitted. But Machiavellian strategy reveals a deeper reality. Total compliance does not build respect, it builds dependency. And dependency is rarely rewarded, because something that always submits does not need to be negotiated with, it simply needs to be used. So the real question becomes this: have you been demonstrating value, or have you been demonstrating availability? Because those two signals create completely different positions in the hierarchy. One creates respect, the other creates endless work. Now pause for a moment and examine your own behavior with brutal honesty. When pressure appears, are you the first person to absorb it, or are you someone whose agreement still carries weight? Because now we're going to uncover something even more disturbing: why many bosses unconsciously lose respect for employees the moment they realize those employees are desperate to be liked. And once you understand that mechanism, you will never look at workplace dynamics the same way again. Before we go there, I want to identify the people who are thinking deeper than the average viewer. Comment this below: I am not here to be used. The people who write that sentence are beginning to see the game behind the game. There is another illusion that traps intelligent employees more effectively than laziness ever could: the desire to be liked. Most workers believe likability protects them. They believe being agreeable, friendly, accommodating, and easy to work with will naturally earn loyalty from those above them. But inside hierarchies, likability behaves differently than people expect. Because the human brain does not organize social groups around kindness, it organizes them around strength. This does not mean physical strength, it means psychological gravity. The subtle sense that someone possesses boundaries that cannot be casually crossed. When this gravity is absent, something strange happens. You may be liked, but you are not respected. And the difference between those two states determines how you're treated under pressure. When deadlines collapse, when mistakes happen, when responsibility needs to land somewhere, people do not ask themselves who they like the most. They ask themselves something far more primitive: who can absorb the pressure without fighting back? If the answer is you, congratulations, you have become the perfect shield, reliable, helpful, and endlessly loaded with other people's problems. This is why many hard workers feel a quiet resentment growing inside them after years in the same environment. They notice something disturbing. Less capable employees somehow maintain lighter workloads. More confident employees somehow avoid the chaos. And yet the person who always delivers is drowning in responsibility. At first, this feels unfair, but Machiavellian observation reveals the deeper pattern. Those employees unconsciously projected limits earlier. They trained the environment to negotiate with them. You trained the environment to rely on you. There is a profound psychological difference between those two positions. Negotiated value commands respect. Automatic value invites extraction. And here's the darker truth. The moment authority figures sense that your primary goal is approval, your leverage collapses. Because approval-seeking behavior reveals dependency. You want their validation, You want their praise. You want their positive perception. And the human brain instantly recognizes this, not through words, but through micro-behaviors: over-explaining, over-agreeing, volunteering too quickly, apologizing too often, smiling through pressure. Each of these signals whispers the same message into the subconscious mind observing you. You want to stay. You want to belong. You will tolerate discomfort to maintain acceptance. Once that signal is detected, something subtle but powerful shifts in the hierarchy. You stop being perceived as a potential equal. You become a resource, useful, reliable, but ultimately controllable. This is precisely why Machiavellian thinkers warn against the addiction to approval. Approval is the most easily manipulated desire in social systems, because the person who needs approval will often trade power to receive it. They will accept more responsibility. They will tolerate unfairness. They will silence their objections, all to preserve the illusion of harmony. But harmony without respect is simply quiet exploitation. Now imagine the opposite psychology. Imagine someone who is calm, competent, professional, but noticeably independent of approval. They do not chase praise. They do not over-explain themselves. They deliver results, but they do not perform gratitude rituals for basic fairness. Their identity does not revolve around being liked. And this creates a strange psychological tension in the minds of authority figures, because independence introduces uncertainty. If this person is mistreated, will they tolerate it? If their boundaries are pushed, will they push back? If they leave, what consequences follow? These questions activate something ancient in the human brain: caution. And caution is the birthplace of respect. This does not mean becoming hostile. It does not mean arrogance. It means something far more strategic: emotional self-containment. You stop broadcasting your need for approval. You stop performing loyalty through exhaustion. You allow your competence to speak without begging for recognition. And when this shift occurs, people begin perceiving you differently, not because your work changed, but because your psychological posture changed. You are no longer signaling desperation for belonging. You are signaling self-possession. And self-possession makes people hesitate before pushing too far. Now ask yourself something honestly. When your boss speaks to you, do they sense independence or do they sense compliance? Because the difference between those two signals determines whether you're treated as an asset or as a safety net for everyone else's problems. Be honest with yourself. Which one are you right now? Comment this below if you're starting to see the pattern. I choose respect over approval. The people who write that sentence are beginning to detach from one of the most dangerous addictions in professional life. Now we will go even deeper into the mechanics of power. We will expose the one trait that quietly forces bosses to treat certain employees with extreme caution, even when those employees are not the most obedient. And once you understand it, you will start noticing it everywhere.
There is a moment in every hierarchy when the masks fall. Not dramatically, not publicly, quietly. It happens the instant a person realizes that someone beneath them cannot be casually controlled. From that moment forward, the relationship changes. Because the deepest force shaping human hierarchies is not kindness, competence, or even loyalty. It is consequence. This is the trait that separates respected individuals from endlessly burdened workers: the presence of consequence. Most employees unknowingly remove consequence from the equation. They make themselves psychologically safe to pressure. They signal patience. They signal tolerance. They signal endless willingness to adapt. And authority figures absorb this information faster than you realize. Your boss may never consciously think the words, but the subconscious mind is constantly calculating one silent question: what happens if I push this person further? If the answer is nothing, the pressure continues. If the answer is uncertain, the pressure slows. If the answer is potentially disruptive, the behavior changes. This calculation happens in boardrooms, offices, friendships, and politics. It is the same ancient mechanism that governed survival in tribal structures thousands of years ago. Individuals who could impose consequences were treated differently, not necessarily liked, but respected. And the brutal truth is that respect stabilizes power far more effectively than affection. Most hardworking employees unintentionally communicate the opposite signal. They demonstrate that no matter how heavy the workload becomes, they will simply endure. They will adapt. They will solve the problem. They will protect the system from collapse. In other words, they become the perfect pressure absorber. From a Machiavellian standpoint, this is a dangerous position, because systems exploit whatever stabilizes them. If removing pressure from the organization depends on you, the organization will continue feeding pressure into you, not maliciously, mechanically. And this is where many employees misinterpret their situation. They think their boss disrespects them, but the reality is colder. Their boss trusts them to tolerate more. Trust without boundaries becomes exploitation. This is why certain employees create an invisible shield around themselves, not through aggression, through consequence. When they speak, there is weight behind their words. When they decline something, it does not feel casual. When they set a boundary, it feels real. Because their behavior suggests that pushing beyond that boundary could create friction, not emotional drama, structural friction. And authority figures instinctively avoid unnecessary friction, the same way water flows around obstacles rather than crashing endlessly against them. This is the secret most people misunderstand. Power in hierarchies does not always come from domination. It comes from becoming an obstacle that cannot be casually ignored. The moment your presence introduces potential disruption, the system begins negotiating with you instead of consuming you. This is exactly why Machiavellian strategy often emphasizes perception over raw effort. People respect what appears difficult to control. They respect what cannot be easily replaced. They respect what carries consequences. And those consequences do not need to be dramatic. Sometimes they are subtle. The possibility that you could withdraw your contribution, the possibility that you could redirect your talent elsewhere, the possibility that your silence could expose weaknesses in the system. When these possibilities exist, behavior changes. Conversations become more careful. Requests become negotiations. Deadlines become discussions. But when these possibilities do not exist, you become infrastructure, reliable, useful, but ultimately invisible. Now, pause for a moment and examine your current position with ruthless clarity. If you suddenly stopped absorbing extra pressure tomorrow, what would happen? Would the system panic, or would it quietly replace you and continue? Your answer to that question reveals the true level of leverage you currently possess, and leverage, not effort, determines respect inside hierarchies. This realization makes many people uncomfortable because it exposes years of conditioning, years of believing that obedience would lead to recognition, years of believing that sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. But Machiavellian realism dismantles that illusion. Recognition rarely follows sacrifice. Recognition follows power. So, now I want to challenge you directly. Comment this below if you are beginning to see the deeper structure behind workplace dynamics. I will not train people to exploit me. The people who write that sentence are starting to understand something dangerous, something liberating, something most employees never dare to examine.
There is one final illusion that keeps capable people trapped in invisible chains: the belief that respect must be earned through relentless effort.
For years, many employees run on this belief like a machine. They push harder, produce more, solve problems faster. They believe that somewhere, eventually, someone above them will look down and say, "This person deserves more." But in most hierarchies, respect does not rise from effort. It emerges from posture. Not physical posture, psychological posture. And the moment you truly understand this, your entire relationship with power begins to shift. Because the most respected individuals inside any structure are rarely the ones chasing recognition. They behave as if recognition is irrelevant. This creates a strange psychological inversion. When someone chases respect, people sense the hunger, the dependency, the need. But when someone behaves as though their value exists independent of external validation, something ancient activates inside the human mind. Curiosity. Why is this person not chasing approval? Why are they not competing for attention? Why do they appear so unmoved? That calm detachment introduces something rare in social systems: status ambiguity. And ambiguity forces the brain to reconsider someone's position in the hierarchy. Suddenly, the person who once looked like obedient labor begins to look different. Not louder, not aggressive, simply self-contained. And self-contained individuals create psychological gravity. Their presence feels stable, measured, unrushed. They are not scrambling to prove their value because their behavior already suggests they understand it. This is why the most powerful shift you can make is internal before it is external. You stop performing usefulness as a survival strategy. You stop signaling desperation to be seen as the hardest worker. Instead, you focus on controlled impact. When you act, it matters. When you speak, people listen. When you commit to something, it carries weight. And when you decline something, the refusal feels deliberate rather than apologetic. This subtle shift forces the environment around you to update its mental model. Because humans are constantly categorizing each other into roles: follower, helper, leader, threat, resource. When you behave like someone whose identity depends on approval, the system categorizes you as a resource. But when you behave like someone who chooses where their energy goes, the system begins categorizing you differently, as someone with options. And people treat those with options very carefully. This is the paradox that thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli understood centuries ago. Power often appears the moment you stop begging for it, because power is not granted to those who request it politely. It gathers around those who behave as though they already possess a portion of it. Now, understand something important. This does not mean arrogance. It does not mean rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Those behaviors often backfire. True strategic posture is quieter. It is discipline. It is restraint. It is the ability to decide where your energy goes instead of allowing the system to decide for you. When someone reaches that state, their entire presence changes. They are still professional, still competent, still reliable, but no longer endlessly absorbent. Pressure no longer flows into them automatically, because the system senses something different: limits, choice, potential consequence. And with that shift, something fascinating begins to happen. The same bosses who once piled endless work onto your desk start asking instead of assuming. Deadlines become negotiable. Requests become conversations. Opportunities appear, not because you suddenly worked harder, but because your perceived position in the hierarchy changed. You stopped behaving like someone who must prove their worth and started behaving like someone who already understands it. That psychological shift is the beginning of leverage. Now, I want you to pause and reflect honestly. What belief about work, respect, or effort will you change after hearing this? Write it in the comments, not a paragraph, just one clear sentence, a rule you will never follow blindly again. Because the people who can articulate that shift are not casual listeners. They are individuals beginning to see the structure beneath everyday interactions, a structure most people never question. But those who do start moving differently through the world.